Hi, I'm Katie Stone. Welcome to Dystopia. This is the 10th in a series of videos designed to open new pathways into dystopia for those unsure where to begin, or for the hardened dystopians out there to offer an opportunity to return to first principles and try and work out what drew you to dystopia in the first place. There are more learning resources, reading lists, and ways to get more involved on my website at katiemcgregorstone.co.uk. But for now, wherever you are on your journey with dystopianism, and however much time and energy you have for this today, you are welcome. So this is the second video where I'm going to be talking about reproduction, the control of reproduction in dystopias. It forms a pair with my previous video. By reproduction, I mean both the literal sexual reproduction, how we make babies, and how babies are made in dystopias, but also more generally how dystopian populations reproduce themselves. So how do a new generation of dystopians, how are they created, how are they educated, how are they raised? To talk about this, I'm going to be focusing again on Rose Macaulay's novel What Not. This is a really great book, so if you haven't read it, I really recommend it. It's very funny, it's very interesting to read a dystopia before dystopianism was really a definite thing. But for those who haven't yet read it, just to give you a quick recap, so Macaulay was writing before the end of the First World War, but her novel is set after the war has ended, world peace has been declared, and the new government is determined to ensure that there is never a world war again. In order to do this, they've established what they call the Ministry of Brains. So the Ministry of Brains has a two-pronged plan in order to stop another world war, and it is essentially to make people cleverer. There's the idea that we're having so many wars because people aren't clever enough. If only they were cleverer, they would be able to avoid these wars. So their two-pronged campaign to make people more clever is first focused on education at all levels of society for adults as well as children. And then, rather more sinisterly, there is a eugenic program to control reproduction. So eugenics, again, I discussed this in my previous video, but for those who haven't watched that, eugenics was a movement founded by Francis Galton, who was Charles Darwin's cousin, and Galton basically took Darwin's idea of we are the products of evolution, right? The human species has evolved to be as it is, and said, okay, well, that means we're still evolving and we should try and intervene in our own evolution to make that evolution better. So we should try and create better people through our breeding choices. And so that in the Ministry of Brains case, what this involves is giving everyone a certificate of how clever they are, so a grade from A to C on how intelligent you are, and then using that to determine who you're essentially allowed to marry. They don't physically ban you from marrying people in so-called undesirable matches, but they use financial incentives. So they encourage you to find a more intelligent partner, and if you do, you might get a bonus from the government. If you choose to have an unintelligent partner, and thus unintelligent babies, that's the idea, then they will be really heavily taxed by the government. So it's this financial incentive deterrence program. And the novel follows Kitty Fremont, who is one of the Ministry in Brains employees, and a number of other employees. We see them try and implement this policy and try and sell it to the British people, right? Try and get people on board with this policy, and we see the various hurdles they have to manage in that journey. So sadly, there is no film of What Not yet. So to illustrate this video, I've chosen to use propaganda posters produced mainly by the British and Indian governments, and maybe some American ones dappled in there. I think propaganda is really central to what dystopianism is about, how dystopian regimes communicate with the people. But it's particularly relevant to Whatnot. We see the Ministry of Brains creating a lot of propaganda, and Macaulay herself worked in the War Office, worked as a journalist, knew a lot about propaganda. So hopefully you'll find this to be complementary. Just to give you a heads up, I will be talking about eugenics, and that does involve talking about racism, talking about ableism, talking about various kinds of reproductive controls. But I won't be going into any great detail on any of those topics. So, to kick us off, I'm starting with this idea of the fit and the unfit. As a kind of central idea of what is eugenics. This is a phrase that I'm borrowing from Margaret Sanger, who was an early feminist, a birth control advocate, and a very committed eugenicist. So her line is, "We need more from the fit, less from the unfit." And I'm going to be going into how do you decide who is fit and unfit, and how do you hope to get more of one and less of the other. To do this, I'm going to be returning to Asha Nadkarni's book, Eugenic Feminism, Reproductive Nationalism in the United States and India. I mentioned this book in my previous video, and I'll be going into it much more detail here, but I still, of course, won't be getting everything that Nadkarni covers. I really do recommend this book if you're interested in the kind of histories of feminism and nationalism, and how that relates to reproduction, to colonial rule, to women's role in politics. There's loads of interesting stuff in there. It's a great kind of broad history of those things, as well as Nadkarni putting forward this theory of what eugenic feminism is. So yeah, I do recommend that. For now, I'm just going to be talking about Nadkarni's central idea. So yeah, what is eugenic feminism? And then I'm going to be applying it to Whatnot, so seeing how we can use it to read and interpret dystopias. I'm going to be looking at a potential tension between Nadkarni's work and dystopian criticism. And then I'm going to end on a more utopian note, thinking about what would a reproductive utopia look like according to Nadkarni. But to start us off, as I say, I'm going to be trying to establish what does Nadkarni mean by eugenic feminism. And first of all, we have to decide what does she mean by eugenics. So I've tried to give you a little introduction to what eugenics involve, but just to know that the dominant kind of historical theory is that eugenics was growing in popularity in the late 19th, early 20th century. Loads of people from all different walks of life, different ends of the political spectrum are interested in eugenics, and then it's adopted by the Nazis very explicitly as part of their project of building a great Aryan nation, and suddenly no one wants to be associated with eugenics anymore, right? So it falls out of favour at that point. But Nadkarni argues that instead of understanding eugenics as falling out of favour after the Nazis took it to its logical conclusion, I draw a line from eugenics to population control to argue that both marry concerns about the maintenance of national stock and of national borders, asserting that nations can be won or lost on the basis of population rather than territory. Right reproduction, the idea of you can reproduce in a right way, enters the public domain as a responsibility of governments and citizens alike. So Nadkarni is here saying that even though people are not necessarily using the language of eugenics anymore, the idea of how strong is a nation, oh, well, let's look at how healthy is its population, or how young is its population, or, you know, in what condition are they and how many of them there are. And trying to make that better, that is a eugenic project, even if you don't use the language of eugenics. But the question remains, what is eugenic feminism, right? How does eugenics relate to feminism? And as Nadkarni points out, it would seem that there's a mismatch here. At first glance, feminism, with its long-standing investments in women's reproductive rights, would seem at odds with a movement explicitly concerned with dictating and controlling reproductive behaviours. Right, so this makes sense. If we associate feminists with fighting for the right to decide when and if people engage in pregnancy and in child rearing, then how can feminism line up with a project of reproductive control? And Nadkarni, has this kind of quite lengthy explanation of this complicated idea, but it begins by saying that both US and Indian nationalist feminisms leverage women's reproductive labour into citizenship rights within the nation state. That is, they use the logic that because women reproduce the nation, they should have full rights within the state. So she's saying that early feminists argue women should have rights, like the right to vote, like the right to own property, because they have children, right? They make the babies, so the babies are what the nation is made up of. So how can they be denied rights within that nation? The problem with this, as Nadkarni points out, is that it really never applies to all the people who are having babies. She writes, Eugenic feminism shapes national identity in negative terms, returning repeatedly to phantom and figural others to define them as precisely what must be excluded in order for a eugenic feminist subject to advance the nation as a whole. So, this idea of we make the nation is almost always articulated not as a kind of general and expansive, a universal we, but it's often an elite group of people who are seen as doing the good form of reproduction. And that is in distinction to what Nadkarni calls these phantom figural others, who are often racialized people, lower class people, disabled people, either foreigners, right, people from other nations whose reproduction endangers our nation, or immigrants who are in some way undermining the reproductive potential of our nation from within. This idea that some people are having too many babies while others have too few demonstrates how you can seem to be arguing for a feminist cause like women getting the right to vote or women getting the right to own property, but its feminist potential is limited if that's only reserved to a few elite women at the expense of everybody else. And this limitation really is brought to the fore when we think about birth control. Now, we tend to associate advocating for birth control, for abortion, as central to what feminism is about. But with early feminists, if we think about the idea that they were arguing, we make the babies, therefore we deserve the rights, they can't really argue the right to not have the babies. That would undermine the very reason why they deserve those rights, right? So in early feminism, birth control tended to be something that would be deployed against other people, would be used to stop other people from having more babies, rather than something that people would use to free themselves, to give themselves more reproductive freedom. So Nadkarni writes, I show how movements for birth control and reproductive rights, which have been central to liberal feminism, can be aligned with far less emancipatory discourses, less freeing discourses. After all, as historian Sarah Hodges reminds us, unlike the American or European historiography of birth control, the uneasy legacy of population control is not part of any emancipatory narrative in the post-colonial world. So we can see here this idea that the early feminists like Sanger would not say we should all have abortion equally. In general, she would say abortion, we should all have birth control or abortion equally. She would say it's really important for lower class people, for poor people, for disabled people to have access to abortion and birth control because there are too many of them. Right. So that's not an emancipatory discourse. That's not a way to get free. That is, in fact, a way to control reproduction and oppress people. And Nadkarni points out this is not to say that movements for reproductive justice are irredeemably compromised and thus should be abandoned. We shouldn't just say, okay, well then abortion and birth control are bad. She says, rather, real reproductive justice would address the racism of an environmental movement that scapegoats indigenous peoples, immigrants, and the poor, the imperialism of regimes of national security, and the coercions of population control. So I hope that gives a little sense of what eugenic feminism is and some of the kind of tensions and contradictions within it. I'm now going to apply these ideas to what not, and show how children move from being glories into being maggots. So this phrasing is taken from how Nadkarni opens her book with these two quotations from early Indian women politicians, certainly people who were campaigning for women's rights. They often had kind of complicated relationship with the term feminism, would associate feminism with being a Western term that they didn't think necessarily applied in India, but certainly they were interested in women's rights and in the question of population control. So these two women are on the one hand Sarojini Naidu and on the other Rama Rao. So this is from Sarojini Naidu's poem To India. And she writes, O young through all thy immemorial years, rise, mother, rise, regenerate from thy gloom, and like a bride high mated with the spheres, beget new glories from thine ageless womb. So this is her poem addressed to Mother India, suggesting that what she wants is for Mother India to beget glories from her womb, to have these children who will be glorious. Because even though Mother India is kind of ancient, she is also always young. She's kind of eternal in this idea. So Nadkarni juxtaposes this, contrasts this with this quotation from Rama Rao. And she says, remarking that more were being born every day into these squalid conditions to live like maggots in a pile of refuse, Rama Rao decides that family planning was of pivotal necessity to the gigantic task of social and economic improvement facing the newly independent nation. So Naidu and Rao are really part of the same project. They often work together on kind of women's rights projects. Um, and yet we can see this really different way that they're talking about the possibility of India's children. On the one hand, India's children are glories coming forth from her eternal womb, and on the other, they are maggots in a pile of refuse. As Nadkarni puts it, instead of thinking of population in terms of national resources to be preserved and fostered, as expressed in the figure of Mother India begetting glories from her endless womb of Naidu's poem, population becomes a problem to be solved. Children are transmogrified, turned from glories into maggots. The two seemingly opposed figurations of children are simply different sides to the same eugenic coin. So what she's showing here is that eugenics doesn't encourage you to think about children or reproduction in only one way. It encourages you to think about them in these two ways. On the one hand, some children are glories, on the other, some are maggots. More from the fit, less from the unfit. And we can see this very directly show up in What Not. So this is a scene where government explainers from the Ministry of Brains have been sent out to talk to the British public. And one of those explainers is a woman called Dr. Cross. So we hear what she says to a village gathering here. Dr. Cross was a gracious and eloquent speaker. The village rather liked her. She talked of babies as one who knew. No doubt she did know, having, as she mentioned, had two herself. She grew pathetic in pleading for the rights of the children to their chance in life. How, said the doctor, were children to win any of life's prizes without brains? Even health, how could health be won and kept without intelligent following of the laws nature had laid down for us? I never did none of that, and look at me, 75 next month and still fit and able, old William Weston was heard to remark. And how was that to be done without intelligence? So we can see that Macaulay's already kind of poking fun at this. You know, you have this idea of, oh, this new government programme is absolutely essential to intelligence and to health, And yet there are already healthy 75-year-olds existing. Clearly, the new program isn't utterly essential, right? So this is a little bit of a joke, but we can see here that people are liking Dr. Cross. This is basically a favourable position of her. And like Sarojini Naidu, like Rama Rao, she is a woman in a public sphere. She is a kind of having a political role here. She is a doctor, but she is also a mother. So we can see the idea that some of her authority comes from being a medical expert, some of it comes from being sent by the government, but some of it comes from this idea that she's had children, right? So we can see this tie between the idea of you should listen to women, you should support and respect these particular elite women because they reproduce the nation, they know what they're talking about. Dr. Cross has been standing up on a kind of tub, a soapbox, but now she stepped down from the tub, took the infants, Rose and Dean, out of their perambulators, out of their prams. These are infants that she'd previously selected, and held them up, one on each arm to the public gaze. Here you have, she said, a certificated child whose parents received a bonus for it, and an uncertificated child whose parents were taxed. Observe the difference in the two. Look at the bright noticing hair of the infant Rose. Of course, she's a juggling of it up and down on her arm, said a small girl who knew the infant Rose. Now compare it with the lethargy of the other baby who lies sucking an India rubber sucker, a foolish and unclean habit in itself, and taking no notice of the world about it. So we can see here that Dr. Cross starts off this pathetic pleading for the rights of all children, but soon we see that it's not in fact the rights of all children. It's in fact the rights of the children who are considered to be glories rather than maggots. And by putting these two children up against one another, that's what she's kind of arguing that they are. We can see that one she's praising for its supposed intelligence, the other she's insulting. And suggesting that it is already unintelligent, it's doomed because its parents had this uncertificated marriage. Of course, we could already point out that as the little girl does, that she's encouraging one of them to look more intelligent, and she seems to be implying that one of the children has chosen for itself a dummy to suck, which I don't think babies do. The mother of the supposedly stupid child is obviously not very happy about this. Why the poor mite, this infant's parents exclaimed, pushing her way to the front. She's been ailing the last 2 days. It's her poor little tummy, that's all. And if you please, ma'am, I'll take her home now. Holding her up to scorn before the village that way, and you call yourself a mother. And I'd like to know what you mean, ma'am, by unregulated marriage. Our marriage was all right. It was highly approved, and we got money by this baby. It's my opinion you've mixed the two children up and are taking mine for Mrs. Rose's there that got taxed, poor mite, owing to Mr. and Mrs. Rose both being in C class. That's right, someone else cried. It's the other one that was taxed and ought to be stupid. You've got 'em mixed up, ma'am. Better luck next time. So obviously we can see here that Macaulay is making a joke at Dr. Cross's expense, and partly this is just a tale of incompetence, right? Dr. Cross has hoped to hold up one baby as clever and the other as stupid, and she's confused them. So she's kind of undermined her own point. But we're also seeing, I think, a deeper critique here of the idea that you could take two babies and, due to their heritage, right, due to their blood, their genes, determine how clever, how successful, how happy they are going to be in life. Babies are so easily muddled up with one another, precisely because it's so difficult to know what they will be like in the future. So we can see dystopianism performing a similar kind of critique than Nadkarni is, saying, look, this is an ideology which would separate children into glories and maggots, but this separation is ludicrous. It doesn't make sense. I'm going to turn now to the potential tension between Nadkarni's writing and my theory, I guess, of dystopias. So in my videos on dystopianism and utopianism, I suggested that dystopias are not just anti-utopias, right? They're not just critical of utopianism. They're critical of some utopias, and I think we can add the idea of eugenic utopias to that list, but they retain a commitment to the idea that you can make a better world, you can transform the world. However, in Nadkarni's writing, eugenics and utopia seem almost inextricably linked. So she writes, Eugenics was an altogether utopian vision, expressing the modern injunction to scientific improvement and progress in biological form. Francis Galton, Charles Darwin's cousin if we remember, viewed the potential for endless progress, understanding eugenics as the humane way to help along the process his cousin had described as natural selection. Instead of letting nature take its violent course, it could be guided by benevolent hands. Utopia is one of the modes eugenics takes. So it seems difficult here to kind of salvage a reproductive utopianism. And we can also see this kind of tendency just to be critical of utopianism in whatnot, and in particular in the form of the Stop It League. So this is Kitty Fremont reading the newspaper. She's thinking, Stop It was the newest weekly newspaper. It was a clever paper, for it succeeded so far, 4 numbers, in not getting suppressed, and also in not committing itself precisely to any direct statement as to what it wanted stopped. There were, of course, so many things that it was quite obvious should be stopped. The command might have been addressed to those of the public who were grumbling, or to the government who were giving them things to grumble at. Indeed, the answer to the inquiry, stop what, might so very plausibly be stop it all, that was a profitless question. So this is a group with an exclusively negative message, right? They don't say what they want, they just say what they don't want. They want you to stop it. And as the novel progresses, we see that this is explicitly directed at the work of the Ministry of Brains, and indeed there is a Stop It procession leading up to the Ministry of Brains at the novel's end. So this reads, the procession drew up outside the Ministry of Brains and resolved itself into a meeting. It was addressed in a short and stirring speech from the ministry steps by the president of the Stop It League, a fiery young man with a megaphone who concluded his remarks with, isn't it up to all who love freedom and all who hate tyranny to lose no time but to wreck the place where these things are done? That's what we're here to do tonight, to smash up this hotel and show the government what the men and women of England mean. So this is a vision of political action as destruction, right? As just saying, we want you to stop. This is a really important critique of the eugenic program the ministry is doing. This is, definitely part of what dystopianism is about. But it leaves us the question: what do the Stop It League want, right? What is the utopian horizon that dystopianism is aiming towards? And I think we see a glimpse of this in this other reflection on Stop It. The question that rather suggested itself to its readers was, if Stop It had its way, what, if anything, would be left? Very little, the editor would have answered. A clean sheet. Then we can begin again. So there's this possibility of rebuilding after the destruction that's being left open here. This promise of new beginnings. And I think we can see that at the novel's close, where the Ministry of Brains' plans have all fallen apart, the ministry's been disbanded, the minister has resigned, and he and Kitty are sitting on a train together. Macaulay writes, so turned the world around, individual desire given way to, as usual, ruining principle and ideals by its soft pressure. What would ever get done in such a world? Nothing, ever. Another note of despair. But suddenly, as if both had seen the same picture, they met one another's eyes across the carriage and laughed ruefully. That, anyhow, they could always do, though sitting among the debris of ruined careers, ruined principles, ruined ministries, ruined ideals. It was something, perhaps, in a sad and precarious world, it was much. So we have this vision at the end, not of any kind of coherent big plan, for how to do a reproductive utopia as opposed to a dystopia, but of this idea of these two people who have defied the laws of the ministry and gotten married. That's the idea, that they were uncertificated for marriage, but they've married one another anyway because they're in love, because they make each other laugh. They've followed this idea of pleasure, of happiness, of desire, as opposed to following the controls of the ministry. So I think that this is an important part of what this new world looks like. It is a world defined by freedom, even if we don't know exactly what that freedom will look like. So that brings us to the idea of what does the reproductive utopia look like? And as I say, Nadkarni is mainly interested in critiquing utopianism, but I think she does leave open these kind of political possibilities which I would align with utopia, even if she wouldn't a kind of critical utopia, an impure utopia. So to end, this is from Nadkarni's book. She writes, a non-eugenic reading practice thus proceeds on three counts. The first involves unpacking the purifying impulse contained in watchwords such as empowerment, progress, utopia, and development, to name just a few. The second involves tracing the effects of how such rhetoric is enacted upon bodies, as people and populations are sorted into the categories of fit and unfit. Finally, the last involves uncovering the workings of eugenics through the very logics of imperialism, development, and globalization. Throughout eugenic feminism, I've attempted to model this non eugenic reading practice by focusing on precisely what eugenics would seek to excise, cut out, even in, or perhaps more accurately, especially in, its most utopian guises. In doing so, I've suggested that the very demand for political purity as the way towards a brighter future is in itself wrapped up in eugenics, and that a truly transnational and post colonial feminist reading practice must show how important political values are potentially co optable in the very name of progress. My aim has been to resist the seductions of the purifying logic of eugenics, even when it is articulated in the name of a more emancipatory future, and to chart a new way forward, albeit messy and imperfect, on a different historical map. So, those are my final thoughts on reproduction and dystopianism, and this is the end of my series. Welcome to Dystopia. I hope to make more videos in future, and you can see updates about them on my website, katiemcgregorstone.co.uk. And I'd love to hear from anyone who's watched these videos if you've found them useful, if you've got questions or problems. But for now, thank you, and you're welcome.